A black woman is quietly pushed out of her first-class seat to make room for a wealthy VIP. The flight crew thought she was just another passenger they could bully into silence. They threatened her with security. They humiliated her in front of a packed plane. But they didn't know she held the power to destroy their entire airline. With one single chilling question, she didn't just take back her dignity. She grounded their entire billion-dollar fleet. Here is her story. The fluorescent lights of John F. Kennedy International Airport's Terminal 4 buzzed with a low, headache-inducing hum. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a relentless November rain battered the tarmac, blurring the runway lights into smeared streaks of neon. It was Friday evening, 7:45 p.m., and the terminal was a chaotic symphony of delayed travelers, rolling suitcases, and garbled intercom announcements. Standing near Gate B, 22, Dr. Josephine Carter just wanted to go home. At 42, Josephine was a woman of quiet, formidable presence. Dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer, crisp white blouse and dark slacks, she carried herself with the kind of effortless authority that usually commanded respect. She was exhausted down to her bones. For the past 3 weeks, she had been buried under mountains of schematics compliance reports and tense boardroom negotiations in Washington, D.C. Now all she wanted was to sink into the wide leather embrace of Seat 1A on Meridian Air Flight 802 to London Heathrow, sip a glass of sparkling water, and sleep across the Atlantic. She had paid $6,000 for the first-class ticket. She had booked it 3 months in advance. When the gate agent finally announced the boarding call for first-class and Diamond Medallion members, Josephine picked up her leather briefcase, smoothed the lapels of her blazer, and joined the short, exclusive line. At the front of the line stood Sheila Dempsey, a gate agent whose tight smile never quite reached her cold, pale blue eyes. Sheila's name tag was crooked, and she was aggressively typing on her keyboard, sighing heavily, as if the mere existence of passengers was a personal insult to her. Josephine stepped up to the podium and placed her phone face down on the scanner. Beep, beep, beep. The scanner flashed a glaring, angry red. Sheila stopped typing. She didn't look up immediately. Instead, she let out a long, exaggerated exhale, popped her chewing gum, and finally raised her eyes to look Josephine up and down. The look was brief, but it spoke volumes. It was a look Josephine had seen 1,000 times in her life, an instantaneous, deeply ingrained calculus that decided she did not belong in the priority line. "Name," Sheila demanded, her voice flat. "Josephine Carter, Seat 1A." Josephine replied, her tone perfectly, even though a familiar prickle of annoyance began to form at the base of her neck. Sheila tapped her long acrylic nails against the keyboard. "Carter. Carter. No, you're not in 1A. I have the receipt right here on my phone, along with the confirmation email from Meridian Air," Josephine said, tapping the screen to pull up the boarding pass she had saved that morning. "I checked in 24 hours ago." "Well, the system says something different," Sheila said dismissively, reaching across the counter to print a thin, thermal paper boarding pass. She ripped it from the machine and slid it across the counter. "There was an equipment change. We had to swap out the aircraft earlier today. The new configuration has fewer first-class seats. You've been reaccommodated." Josephine looked down at the slip of paper. "Seat 34E economy. Middle seat. In the very last row of the Boeing 777, right next to the lavatories. Reaccommodated." Josephine repeated her voice, dropping a fraction of an octave into a register that made her subordinates in Washington stand up straight. "You moved me from a paid first-class window seat to the last row of economy. Surely there is another first-class seat available, or business class, or premium economy." "Ma'am, the flight is completely full," Sheila said, her tone dripping with the kind of weaponized customer service politeness designed to infuriate. When there's an equipment change, the system automatically reshuffles passengers based on status. You don't have our diamond medallion status, so you were bumped. I paid full fare. $6,000. Josephine stated, holding Sheila's gaze. I am not flying for 11 hours in a middle seat by the bathrooms when I purchased a premium ticket. If you overbooked the cabin, you need to ask for volunteers, not forcibly downgrade a paying passenger. Look, honey. Sheila snapped, the veneer of politeness vanishing entirely. I don't make the rules. The system did it. You can either take 34E and file a complaint for a partial refund on our website tomorrow, or you can step out of the line and wait for a flight tomorrow afternoon. Do you want to fly today or not? Before Josephine could dismantle the blatant violation of the Department of Transportation's bumping regulations, a loud, booming voice interrupted them. Sheila, sweetheart, tell me you saved me a spot. A tall, red-faced man in his late 50s pushed past Josephine, nearly knocking her leather briefcase out of her hand. He reeked of expensive bourbon, stale cigar smoke, and unearned entitlement. He wore a designer golf polo and a Rolex that caught the harsh terminal lights. Sheila's entire demeanor transformed. The scowl melted into a bright, fawning smile. Mr. Stanton, so wonderful to see you. We were wondering if you were going to make it. Bradley Stanton chuckled, wiping rain from his forehead. Traffic on the Van Wyck was a nightmare. Tell me my usual is ready. Of course, Mr. Stanton, Sheila said, typing rapidly. I had to do a little reshuffling, but I secured it for you. The printer whirred. Sheila ripped off the boarding pass and handed it to him with both hands. Josephine's eyes darted to the large, bold text on the ticket in Bradley Stanton's hand. Seat 1A. The air between them seemed to freeze. The sheer audacity of the lie hung in the space between the podium and the boarding door. There had been no equipment change. There was no automatic reshuffling. Sheila had manually overridden the system, kicking a black woman out of her fully paid first-class seat to give it to a wealthy white man who happened to be a regular. Josephine felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over her. It was the same icy focus she felt when she uncovered a catastrophic structural flaw in an airplane wing. You told me there was an equipment change. Josephine said, her voice quiet, cutting through the terminal noise like a scalpel. Sheila glared at her, completely unapologetic. Mr. Stanton is a Global Executive Platinum member. He has priority. I suggest you take your new boarding pass and get on the plane, ma'am, before I decide you're being disruptive, and deny you boarding entirely. Bradley Stanton glanced at Josephine, his expression a mixture of amusement and pity. Tough break, lady. Look, just take the coach seat. You'll get there at the exact same time I will. He flashed a condescending grin and walked down the jet bridge, whistling softly. Josephine stared at Sheila. The gate agent had her hand hovering over a red phone, her eyes daring Josephine to make a scene. She wanted Josephine to raise her voice. She wanted her to become the angry black woman, so she could call security, cancel her ticket entirely, and feel justified in her bigotry. But Josephine Carter was not a woman who made scenes. She was a woman who made consequences. Without another word, Josephine picked up the boarding pass for 34E. She looked at Sheila one last time, memorizing the spelling of her name on the crooked badge, memorizing the terminal gate, the time, the flight number. I will take my seat, Josephine said softly. Sheila smirked in triumph. Have a nice flight. Josephine turned and walked down the jet bridge. She knew exactly what she was going to do. She wasn't just going to get her seat back. She was going to tear their entire operation apart. The jet bridge was steep enclosed and smelled faintly of hydraulic fluid, damp carpet, and the unmistakable metallic tang of aviation fuel. The ribbed walls amplified the sound of Josephine's sensible low heels as she walked toward the open door of the massive Boeing 777-300ER. Normally, Josephine would use this walk to decompress, but right now her mind was moving at 1,000 frames a second. The insult at the gate was infuriating, yes. The blatant discrimination made her blood boil. But as she paused near the accordion-like connection between the jet bridge and the aircraft fuselage, her instincts as an engineer and investigator kicked in. She looked through the narrow, rain-streaked window of the jet bridge, down at the tarmac. Floodlights illuminated the underbelly of the massive aircraft. The ground crew, clad in neon yellow rain slicks, were moving quickly, too quickly. Josephine's eyes locked onto the main landing gear on the starboard side. Even through the rain, she could see a mechanic arguing with a man holding a red maintenance clipboard. The mechanic was pointing at the massive multi-wheel bogie of the landing gear. Specifically, he was pointing toward the brake assembly. Josephine squinted, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. In her line of work, the details were a matter of life and death, and right now she was looking directly at the brake wear indicator pins extending from the brake assembly. Or rather, she was looking at the lack of them. The pins were completely flush with the housing. That meant the carbon brake pads were worn down to their absolute minimum tolerance limit. But that wasn't what made her stomach drop. What made her blood turn to ice was the mechanic aggressively tearing a red tag off the landing gear, strut a Class A grounding tag, and handing it to the man with the clipboard, who merely shrugged, signed a piece of paper, and walked away. They didn't replace the brakes. Meridian Air was notorious in aviation regulatory circles for stretching maintenance windows, but this was beyond cutting corners. A fully loaded 777 flying across the Atlantic with flush wear indicator pins was a disaster waiting to happen. If they had to abort takeoff at V1 speed, the brakes would shatter. They wouldn't stop the plane. They would ignite it. Josephine pulled herself away from the window. The anger about her seat evaporated, replaced by a cold, professional dread. She stepped onto the aircraft. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Brenda, with helmet-like blonde hair and a forced smile, barely looked at her. "Keep moving to the back, please. Aisles are getting clogged." Josephine walked through the first-class cabin. The seats were massive private pods. In seat 1A, Bradley Stanton was already comfortably settled, kicking his loafers off and accepting a glass of Laurent Perrier champagne from a flight attendant. He didn't even notice Josephine walk past. She moved through the curtain into business class, then into the sprawling, cramped sea of economy. By the time she reached row 34, the air was stuffy smelling of nervous sweat and the chemicals from the adjacent lavatories. Seat 34E was exactly what she expected. A narrow sliver of uncomfortable fabric wedged between a teenager loudly playing video games on his phone and an elderly man who was already asleep and snoring softly. Josephine didn't sit down. She stood in the aisle as the remaining passengers filed past her. She clutched her briefcase to her chest, her mind racing. The flight was scheduled to push back in 15 minutes. Once those doors closed and the engine started, she would have zero leverage, and 300 people would be hurtling through the sky on an illegal, unsafe aircraft. She waited until the final passenger had boarded and the overhead bins were being slammed shut. Then she turned around and walked back up the aisle. "Ma'am, you need to take your seat," a junior flight attendant said, as Josephine passed row 15. "We are preparing for departure." "I need to speak to the lead flight attendant," Josephine said, not breaking her stride. She pushed through the curtain, separating premium economy from business class, and then through the heavy velvet curtain into the front galley right outside the cockpit door. Brenda, the lead flight attendant, turned around sharply, nearly spilling a tray of warm, mixed nuts. "Excuse me. You cannot be up here. Passengers are not allowed in the forward galley during pre-flight." "I need to speak to the captain." Josephine said, her voice quiet, but carrying an undeniable weight. Brenda laughed, a sharp, patronizing sound. "Absolutely not. The captain is preparing for pushback. Now I suggest you turn around and go back to your seat before I write you up for non-compliance." "Brenda, is it?" Josephine said, reading her name tag. "This isn't about passenger service. This is a matter of aircraft safety. The starboard main landing gear brakes are completely worn out. I saw a ground crew member pull a red grounding tag without performing the required maintenance. The aircraft is not airworthy." Brenda's eyes narrowed. The patronizing smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer disdain. "Who do you think you are? Did you see a documentary on YouTube and think you're an expert? You're just angry because you got bumped from your seat. Sheila at the gate warned us about you. She said you might try to cause a disruption." "I don't care about the seat right now," Josephine said, stepping closer, refusing to be intimidated. "I am telling you that if this plane attempts a high-speed aborted takeoff, the carbon brakes will fail catastrophically. The captain signed off on a falsified maintenance log. Tell him to come out here right now." "I will do no such thing," Brenda hissed. "You are interfering with a flight crew. That is a federal offense. I am giving you one last warning. Go back to row 34, sit down and shut your mouth, or I will have you removed from this aircraft." The commotion in the galley had drawn the attention of the first-class passengers. Bradley Stanton leaned out of his pod in 1A, a smirk playing on his lips. "Hey, Brenda, is there a problem? Do we need to get the marshals for this lady?" Before Brenda could reply, the fortified cockpit door clicked and swung open. Captain Richard Davies stepped out. He was a tall man in his late 50s, his uniform immaculate, 4 gold stripes gleaming on his shoulders. He carried the aura of a man who was used to absolute obedience. He looked at Josephine, then at Brenda. "What is the delay here, Brenda? We've got clearance for pushback in 4 minutes." Davies barked, running a hand through his greying hair. "Captain, this passenger from economy is refusing to take her seat," Brenda said, quickly playing the victim. "She barged up here demanding to see you, and making ridiculous claims about our maintenance crew to cause a panic." Captain Davies turned his gaze to Josephine. It was the same look Sheila had given her at the gate, dismissive, annoyed superior. "Listen to me very carefully, ma'am," Davies said, his voice dropping into a low, threatening rumble. "I am the master of this vessel. My ground crew is the best in the business. I don't know what kind of stunt you're trying to pull because you're unhappy with your coach seat, but it ends now. You are delaying my flight." "Captain Davies," Josephine said, entirely unfazed by his posturing. "Under Federal Aviation Regulation, Part 121, you are required to ensure the aircraft is completely airworthy. I watched your mechanic pull a Class A red tag from the starboard bogie without replacing the brake pads. The wear pins are flush. Your minimum equipment list waiver for those brakes expired at midnight. You signed the tech log anyway." For a fraction of a second, Davies's eyes widened. A flicker of genuine shock crossed his face. How could a random woman in economy know the exact regulatory codes, the status of the wear pins, and the exact expiration time of a deeply buried FAA waiver? But arrogance quickly overtook his surprise. He puffed out his chest, stepping into her personal space to intimidate her. "I don't know how you know those terms, lady, but you have no idea what you're talking about," Davies snarled. "I signed off on that aircraft because it is safe, and even if it wasn't, I don't answer to angry passengers trying to play airplane mechanic. I answer to the FAA." Josephine did not step back. She looked the captain dead in the eye. "Are you absolutely certain you want to make that statement, Captain Brenda?" Davies snapped, turning his back on Josephine. "Call the gate. Get Port Authority police down here. I want her off my plane, now." "With pleasure, Captain," Brenda said, reaching for the interphone. Bradley Stanton raised his champagne glass in a mocking toast. Have a nice trip back to the terminal, lady." Josephine stood perfectly still amidst the hostile glares. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She just tightened her grip on her leather briefcase. They wanted security, fine. She would give them exactly what they asked for. The tension in the forward galley was thick, heavy, and suffocating. The low murmur of first-class passengers whispering to each other filled the silence. Everyone was watching the black woman in the charcoal blazer, waiting for her to break, to scream, or to beg. She did none of those things. Josephine Carter stood with the calm, immovable stillness of a mountain. 3 minutes later, heavy footsteps echoed down the jet bridge. 2 Port Authority police officers, fully geared with tactical vests and radios crackling, stepped through the aircraft door. The taller officer, whose name tag read Miller, assessed the scene instantly. His eyes moved past Captain Davies, past Brenda, and locked onto Josephine. To him the dynamic was obvious, an irate passenger causing a disturbance. "What seems to be the problem here?" Captain Officer Miller asked, resting a hand casually on his utility belt. "This passenger forced her way into the forward galley, harassed my crew, and is refusing to take her seat," Captain Davies said, his voice dripping with exhausted authority. "She's making wild accusations and trying to incite a panic about the safety of my aircraft. I want her removed for interfering with a flight crew. We're already 10 minutes behind schedule." Miller nodded, turning to Josephine. His tone was professional, but left no room for negotiation. "Ma'am, I need you to gather your belongings and step off the aircraft with us. We can sort this out in the terminal." "I am not leaving this aircraft, Officer Miller," Josephine said, her voice eerily calm. The second officer, Hayes, frowned, stepping forward. "Ma'am, it wasn't a request. The captain has the legal right to refuse transport to anyone causing a disruption. If you don't come voluntarily, we will have to remove you physically. You do not want to catch federal charges tonight. Please just walk with us." "Yeah, lady, the show's over." Bradley Stanton chimed in from 1A, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "Take your attitude back to the coach terminal." Josephine ignored Stanton completely. She kept her eyes on the 2 police officers. "Officers, before you touch me, I need you to listen to me very carefully. If you physically remove me from this aircraft at the behest of this captain, you will be aiding and abetting the departure of a legally grounded, unsafe aircraft. You will also be interfering with a federal investigator in the course of her duties." Officer Miller paused, his brow furrowing. Federal investigator Captain Davies let out a loud, contemptuous scoff. "She's out of her mind. She's a bumped economy passenger throwing a tantrum. Grab her, Miller. Let's go." Josephine slowly placed her leather briefcase on the galley counter. She did it so deliberately that the police officers instinctively stepped back, watching her hands. With a sharp click, she unlatched the brass clasp. She reached inside and pulled out a heavy, dark blue leather wallet. She flipped it open and held it up. The harsh fluorescent lights of the galley caught the brilliant gleam of a solid gold badge. Next to it was a laminated federal identification card bearing her photograph, an eagle crest, and a very specific set of credentials. The silence that fell over the cabin was absolute. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears. Officer Miller leaned in his eyes, scanning the ID. He read the text aloud, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Dr. Josephine Carter, Senior Executive Director, Flight Standards and Safety Compliance, Federal Aviation Administration." Miller swallowed hard, taking a sudden, massive step backward, putting distance between himself and Captain Davies. Officer Hayes immediately dropped his hand from his belt, his posture stiffening into a rigid stance of respect. Captain Davies's face went completely slack. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by a sudden chalky pallor. The blood drained from Brenda's face so fast she looked like she might faint into the galley carts. Even Bradley Stanton froze his glass of champagne, hovering halfway to his mouth. Josephine didn't look at the officers. She didn't look at Brenda or the stunned millionaire in her stolen seat. She locked her eyes onto Captain Richard Davies. "As I was saying, Captain," Josephine began, her voice echoing in the dead, silent cabin. "You told me you answer to the FAA. Well, I am the FAA. Davies opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. "So I am going to ask you one question," Josephine said, stepping closer to him, her presence now towering over his despite her height. "And I advise you to think incredibly carefully about your answer, because everything you say from this second forward is part of an official federal audit." She stared him down, her eyes burning with righteous fury and absolute legal authority. "Captain Davies, what is the precise measurement in millimeters of the brake wear indicator pins on the starboard main landing gear of this specific aircraft, and why did you intentionally falsify the pre-flight inspection log for an aircraft whose FAA safety waiver expired exactly 8 hours ago?" I... Davies stammered, sweat immediately beading on his forehead. "The ground chief. The tech log said..." "Do not lie to me." Josephine's voice cracked like a whip. "I saw the mechanic pull the red tag. I saw you sign the release. You and I both know those pins are flush. The brakes are carbon-worn beyond the legal limit. If you abort takeoff at maximum gross weight, those brakes will shatter, sever the hydraulic lines, and ignite the fuel tanks. You were about to risk the lives of 312 passengers and crew, so Meridian Air wouldn't have to take a delay penalty on your record." "Doctor, Carter, please," Davies whispered, all of his bravado shattered into a million pieces. "It's the company pressure. Management rides us on on-time departures. The maintenance base in London was going to swap the brakes as soon as we landed. We just needed to get it across the pond." A collective gasp rippled through the first-class cabin. Passengers who had been glaring at Josephine a moment ago were now staring at their captain in absolute horror. "You admit to knowingly operating an unairworthy aircraft to appease corporate metrics?" Josephine asked quietly. Davies squeezed his eyes shut, realizing he had just confessed to a federal crime in front of 2 police officers and a cabin full of witnesses. Josephine turned to the police officers. "Officer Miller, this aircraft is officially impounded by order of the Federal Aviation Administration under emergency authority. Have the gate agent deploy the jet bridge fully. No one goes anywhere. I want the flight data recorder secured, and I want the ground crew chief detained for questioning." "Yes, Director Carter." "Right away," Miller said, quickly, tapping his radio to call for immediate backup. Josephine turned her attention back to the shaking captain. "Hand me the technical logbook, Davies. Now." Trembling Davies reached into the cockpit and handed her the heavy binder containing the aircraft's maintenance history. Josephine flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the forged signatures and rubber-stamped approvals. The sheer scale of the negligence was staggering. It wasn't just this flight. It was a pattern. "This isn't an isolated incident," Josephine murmured, her eyes scanning a page from 2 weeks prior. "You've been signing off on deferred maintenance for the thrust reversers, the APU bleed valves, and the hydraulic lines across multiple tails." She snapped the logbook shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. "Captain Davies, you are relieved of command. Your pilot's certificate is suspended effective immediately. Collect your personal belongings and exit the aircraft." Brenda began to sob quietly, hiding her face in her hands. Josephine wasn't finished. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket and dialed a number she knew by heart. The director of the National Transportation Safety Board. She put the phone to her ear, looking out the galley window at the Meridian Air logo painted on the fuselage. "Mark," Josephine said when the line connected. "It's Josephine. I'm standing on Meridian Flight 802 at JFK. We have a massive systemic breach of Part 121 compliance, forged maintenance logs, expired waivers, and active collusion between flight crews and ground maintenance to bypass safety criticals. She paused, listening to the voice on the other end, her eyes drifting over to Bradley Stanton, who was now shrinking back into his seat, completely terrified of the woman he had just insulted. "Yes, it's fleet-wide," Josephine continued coldly. "Draft the emergency order. I want an immediate ground stop issued for every single Meridian Air Boeing 777 currently in the United States. None of them take off until my team audits every inch of their maintenance records." She hung up the phone and slipped it back into her pocket. She hadn't just grounded one unsafe flight. With a single question and a phone call, she had just grounded an entire billion-dollar fleet. And she had only just begun. The order to disembark didn't come over the standard public address system with a cheerful pre-recorded jingle. It was delivered by the first officer, whose voice shook with a mixture of adrenaline and dread, instructing all passengers to gather their belongings and exit the aircraft immediately under the authority of the Federal Aviation Administration. Panic threatened to bubble up in the economy cabin, but the presence of the Port Authority police officers, now stationed at the bulkhead, kept the chaos to a tense murmur. As the passengers filed forward, their eyes inevitably fell upon the scene in the first-class galley. Captain Davies had slumped against the beverage cart, stripped of his authority, looking 20 years older. Brenda, the lead flight attendant, was frantically wiping away ruined mascara, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. And then there was Bradley Stanton, the wealthy executive who only moments ago had reveled in stealing Josephine's seat, was completely frozen in Pod 1A. As the economy passengers, the very people he had mocked, marched past him, several shot him looks of pure venom. They had heard the confrontation. They knew exactly what had transpired. "Ma'am," Bradley croaked, as Josephine stood near the cockpit door, overseeing the evacuation. His face had lost its ruddy flush, replaced by an ashen, sickly grey. "Dr. Carter, I had no idea. The gate agent told me the seat was available. I didn't know they were putting us on a broken plane. I swear." Josephine did not offer him a smile. She did not offer him absolution. She looked down at him with the same cool, clinical detachment she would use to inspect a stress fracture on a titanium fuselage. "Mr. Stanton," Josephine said, her voice perfectly level, "ignorance of the aircraft's mechanical state is a luxury you pay for, but your arrogance was entirely your own. I suggest you pack your things and join the line. Your Global Executive Platinum status does not exempt you from an emergency evacuation." Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Without another word, he scrambled to grab his designer carry-on, keeping his head ducked low as he merged into the line of displaced economy, passengers thoroughly stripped of his manufactured dignity. Up at Gate B, 22, Sheila Dempsey was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction when she saw the flashing lights of the Port Authority cruisers out on the tarmac and received the call that police had boarded Flight 802. She assumed her master plan had worked flawlessly. The disruptive woman who had dared to question her authority was finally being hauled off in cuffs. Sheila leaned over the podium, watching the jet bridge door, a triumphant smirk plastered across her face. She already had the incident report typed up, ready to hit submit to permanently ban Josephine Carter from Meridian Air. The heavy door swung open, but it wasn't Josephine in handcuffs. First came Captain Davies, his head bowed, flanked tightly by Officer Miller. Then came the passengers buzzing with angry, panicked energy. And finally, walking with the undeniable stride of a commander who had just conquered a battlefield, was Dr. Josephine Carter. Sheila's smirk faltered. "What is going on here? Why is everyone deplaning?" Josephine walked straight up to the podium. She did not raise her voice, but the sheer gravity of her presence forced Sheila to take a step back. Sheila Dempsey. Josephine read the name tag aloud, her eyes locking onto the gate agents. At 7:52 p.m., you manually removed my passenger profile from seat 1A. You overrode the automated system, falsely claimed an equipment change, and assigned my purchase ticket to another passenger based purely on personal bias and his frequent flyer status. Is that correct? I don't have to answer to you. Sheila stammered, her voice pitching high, her eyes darting frantically toward the police officers who had now secured the boarding area. I followed protocol. You were being aggressive. Josephine placed her gold FAA badge directly on the scanner pad. I am Director Carter with the Federal Aviation Administration. Flight 802 is officially impounded for critical safety violations. Josephine declared, her voice carrying across the entire gate area, ensuring every angry passenger heard exactly who was to blame. Furthermore, I am opening an immediate federal inquiry into the discriminatory ticketing practices at this terminal. Your terminal manager will be here in 5 minutes. I suggest you log out of that console, Ms. Dempsey. You are done here. Sheila stared at the gold badge. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale cheeks stark against her heavy makeup. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The woman she had thought she could bully, the woman she had deemed unworthy of a first-class seat, held the power to destroy her entire career. Sheila's hands shook violently as she reached for the keyboard. She logged out the screen, going black, a perfect reflection of her future in the aviation industry. While chaos reigned at Terminal 4, an entirely different kind of panic was exploding 800 miles away in Chicago, Illinois. Inside the towering glass and steel headquarters of Meridian Air, CEO, Richard Lawson was jolted awake by the shrill ringing of his encrypted cell phone. It was 9:15 p.m. As a man who aggressively engineered corporate buyouts and slashed operational budgets to inflate shareholder dividends, Lawson was used to late-night crises, but the tone of his chief operations officer on the other end of the line was something he had never heard before: pure, unfiltered terror. "Richard, we have a catastrophic situation," the COO practically shouted. "JFK just issued a hard ground stop for Flight 802. The captain's been relieved of duty, and port police are interrogating the ground crew." Lawson sat up in his penthouse bed, rubbing his temples. "Over what? If it's a union dispute, fire the crew and bring in the reserves. We cannot afford a missed slot at Heathrow. It costs us hundreds of thousands of dollars." "It's not a union dispute, Richard. It's the FAA, specifically Dr. Josephine Carter. She was on the plane." Lawson froze. The name sent an icy shard of dread straight into his heart. In the aviation world, Josephine Carter was a legend, an unyielding, incorruptible force of nature. She was the engineer who had single-handedly grounded an entire line of regional jets 3 years ago after discovering a microscopic flaw in the tail assembly, bankrupting a manufacturer in the process. She didn't care about politics. She didn't care about profits. She only cared about safety. Why the hell was the senior executive director of flight standards on one of our planes? Lawson demanded, his voice rising. She was flying commercial, back to London. And Richard, she didn't just ground 802. She called the NTSB. They've issued an emergency directive. Every single Boeing 777 in our fleet is currently barred from taking off anywhere in the United States. They are impounding our entire wide-body operation. "That is impossible," Lawson roared, throwing off his silk sheets. "That's 34 aircraft. That's half our daily revenue. Call our lobbyists in D.C. Call the Secretary of Transportation. Get that grounding order lifted right now. Claim it's an overreach by a rogue inspector. Do whatever it takes." "We tried," the COO said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The DOT won't touch it. Carter has photographs of flush wear pins on 802, and she confiscated the technical logs. The logs are forged, Richard. And if she starts digging into the central database, she's going to see the directive. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the line. The directive. 6 months ago, facing a massive quarterly loss, Lawson had quietly issued a memo to all regional maintenance directors. The memo euphemistically titled Operational Efficiency Initiative 4. A essentially ordered maintenance crews to push non-critical safety repairs including brake pads, hydraulic lines, and thrust reversers past their legal expiration limits to keep planes in the air during the lucrative holiday season. It was a calculated, deadly gamble. "Listen to me," Lawson hissed, his mind racing. "Lock down the Chicago servers, wipe the internal comms related to Initiative 4A, blame it all on Captain Davies and the JFK ground crew, paint them as rogue employees cutting corners. If we isolate the cancer, we can save the fleet. Do not let Carter get access to the mainframe." Back in New York, Josephine had already anticipated the corporate counterattack. She had commandeered an empty conference room in the terminal, turning it into a makeshift war room. Whiteboards were instantly covered in flight numbers, tail registries, and maintenance schedules. 2 junior FAA inspectors had arrived from the regional office, looking wide-eyed and terrified at the magnitude of what their boss had just unleashed. "Director Carter," one of the inspectors, a young man named Harris, said nervously. "Meridian's corporate lawyers are flooding the zone. They're filing emergency injunctions to release the fleet. They are claiming Captain Davies acted alone, and that you are acting outside your jurisdiction by applying a blanket grounding order based on a single aircraft." Josephine did not look up from the technical logbook she was dissecting. "Let them file all the injunctions they want. A systemic failure of this magnitude does not happen in a vacuum. Captains do not risk federal prison to save the company a few dollars unless there is a gun to their head." She closed the logbook and looked out the window. The rain had stopped, and out on the tarmac, the massive shape of Flight 802 sat dark and silent, surrounded by maintenance vehicles and police tape. "They are going to try to burn the evidence," Josephine said, her voice hard. "They are going to try to pin this on the lowest people on the totem pole. I need the JFK ground maintenance chief in this room. Right now." At 2 a.m., the door to the conference room opened. Officer Miller led a young, exhausted-looking man in a grease-stained jumpsuit into the room. He couldn't have been older than 25. His name tag read, Wright. He was shaking like a leaf. "Thomas Wright," Josephine said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Sit down." Thomas collapsed into the chair, burying his face in his rough, calloused hands. "Am I going to jail God? I have a 2-year-old daughter. I told the chief we couldn't push that plane. I told him the pins were flush. But he said if I didn't pull the red tag, I'd be fired by morning." "Thomas, look at me," Josephine commanded. Her voice softened slightly, shifting from the hardened investigator to a tone of quiet empathy. "I am not here to destroy your life. I know you were following orders. But right now, Meridian Air's corporate executives are drafting press releases blaming you and your crew for this entire incident. They are going to throw you to the wolves to protect their stock price." Thomas looked up, his eyes wide with betrayal and fear. "They can't do that. It came from corporate. The pressure to bypass the minimum equipment list waivers. It came from the top." "I know it did," Josephine said, leaning forward. "But knowing it and proving it in a federal court are 2 very different things. Meridian is currently wiping their servers in Chicago. By sunrise, any email or memo connecting the CEO to this maintenance fraud will be gone. I need a smoking gun, Thomas, and I need it now." Thomas bit his lip, his eyes darting around the room. The silence stretched thick with tension. He was weighing his entire career, his family's livelihood, against the devastating truth. He looked at Josephine's unyielding gaze, and he saw the one person who actually had the power to protect him. "There's a shadow server," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. Josephine's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "The maintenance chief's new corporate would try to screw us if a plane ever went down," Thomas explained rapidly. "When the Operational Efficiency Initiative came down from CEO Lawson 6 months ago, my chief didn't trust it. He printed the original unredacted email, the one where Lawson explicitly states that any maintenance base reporting a delay due to non-critical mechanical compliance would face immediate termination." "Where is it?" Josephine asked, her pulse quickening. "It's not digital." The chief locked a hard copy in his personal locker in the subterranean maintenance break room here at JFK, locker 42. He gave me the combination in case anything ever happened to him. Josephine stood up instantly. She turned to Officer Miller. "We need to secure that locker immediately, before Meridian's goons realize what the chief kept." The descent into the bowels of Terminal 4 was a tense, claustrophobic journey. Josephine, flanked by the 2 Port Authority officers, and a terrified Thomas Wright, navigated a labyrinth of concrete corridors that smelled of ozone and damp earth. As they rounded the corner to the maintenance break room, Josephine's heart stopped. 2 men in sharp, dark suits, corporate fixers, were already there, standing in front of a bank of battered metal lockers. One of them had a heavy pair of bolt cutters in his hands, clamped firmly around the padlock of locker 42. "Stop right there!" Officer Miller bellowed, drawing his stun gun. "Drop the cutters' hands where I can see them." The fixers froze. The man with the bolt cutters slowly lowered them to the concrete floor, raising his hands in surrender. They had been mere seconds away from destroying the only physical evidence that could bring down the airline's executive board. "Step away from the locker," Josephine ordered, walking forward with icy authority. The men complied, glaring at her with venomous defeat. Josephine stepped up to locker 42. She looked at Thomas, who nodded and whispered the combination. 341208. Josephine spun the dial. The heavy brass padlock clicked open. She pulled the metal door wide. Inside, nestled beneath a pair of steel-toed boots and a high-visibility jacket, was a manila folder. Josephine pulled it out and flipped it open. There, printed on crisp white paper, was the email. The sender was Richard Lawson, CEO. The recipient was the Director of Global Maintenance, Subject Q4, Operational Directives, and Maintenance Deferrals. Josephine's eyes scanned the text. It was worse than she thought. It wasn't just a suggestion to speed things up. It was a blatant, calculated mandate to ignore federal safety regulations to protect the bottom line. It explicitly ordered the bypassing of brake inspections on wide-body aircraft to maintain the transatlantic schedule. She had them. She had the smoking gun. "Officer Miller," Josephine said, holding the file tightly against her chest. "Arrest these 2 men for tampering with evidence in a federal investigation, and call the FBI. We need warrants for the immediate arrest of the executive board of Meridian Air." 3 weeks later, the atmosphere inside the United States Capitol was electric. The grand congressional hearing room was packed to absolute capacity. A sea of reporters, flashing cameras, and murmuring spectators filled every available inch of space. At the center of the room, sitting at a long mahogany table, was Richard Lawson, flanked by a phalanx of the most expensive defense attorneys money could buy. Lawson looked haggard. His arrogant sheen had completely evaporated. Meridian Air's stock had plummeted by 80% since the night of Flight 802. The entire 777 fleet was still grounded, and the company was hemorrhaging tens of millions of dollars a day. But Lawson was still fighting. For the past 2 hours, his lawyers had been spinning a web of deceit, claiming the memo was a forgery, a desperate fabrication by disgruntled employees to cover up their own incompetence. Sitting across from him at the witness table was Dr. Josephine Carter. She wore the same tailored charcoal blazer she had worn the night of the downgrade. She sat perfectly upright, hands folded neatly in front of her, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. The chairman of the Senate Aviation Subcommittee, a silver-haired senator from Ohio, adjusted his microphone. Dr. Carter, the defense asserts that your grounding of the Meridian fleet was a gross overreaction. They claim the document you recovered from the JFK locker is a fake fabricated by union mechanics. How do you respond? The room fell dead silent. Every camera lens was trained on Josephine. She leaned forward, adjusting her own microphone. Mr. Chairman, men like Richard Lawson believe that power is derived from money status and the ability to bully those beneath them into silence. They believe that if they put enough layers of corporate bureaucracy between themselves and the tarmac, they are immune to the laws of physics and the laws of this nation. She paused, her eyes locking directly onto Lawson. He swallowed hard, refusing to meet her gaze. The document is not a forgery. Josephine continued, her voice ringing out with crystal clarity. Because yesterday afternoon, the FBI raided Meridian's off-site data backup facility in Nevada. The facility mister, Lawson thought he had successfully hidden. We recovered the original digital footprint of the email complete with the CEO's encrypted signature. Furthermore, we recovered correspondence between Mr. Lawson and the ground chiefs, threatening to ruin their lives if they didn't comply with his illegal directives. A collective gasp erupted from the gallery. Lawson's lead attorney buried his face in his hands. The game was over. This was not incompetence. Josephine stated, her voice rising to fill the cavernous room. This was a calculated sociopathic gamble with human life. 312 souls boarded Flight 802, trusting that the people in charge valued their safety more than their profit margins. That trust was violently betrayed. If that plane had attempted to abort takeoff, it would have resulted in one of the deadliest aviation disasters in American history, and it would have happened precisely because Richard Lawson ordered it to. Josephine stood up. She picked up her leather briefcase, the same briefcase she had carried down the jet bridge that fateful night. The FAA is permanently revoking Meridian Air's operating certificate for wide-body aircraft, Josephine announced to the stunned room. And as of this morning, the Department of Justice has formally indicted Mr. Lawson and 5 members of his executive board on 312 counts of reckless endangerment and conspiracy to commit federal fraud. Pandemonium broke out. Reporters shouted questions, camera flashes exploded like fireworks, and the gavel banged furiously over the uproar. Through it all, Josephine Carter simply turned and walked down the center aisle of the hearing room. She ignored the microphones shoved in her face. She ignored the desperate shouts of Lawson's defense team. She walked out of the Capitol building and into the crisp, bright morning air of Washington, D.C. Later that evening at Dulles International Airport, Josephine finally boarded her flight to London. She walked down the jet bridge, feeling the familiar, comforting hum of the massive aircraft. She stepped onto the plane. The lead flight attendant smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Carter. We are honored to have you." Josephine smiled back. She walked into the first-class cabin and settled into seat 1A. She placed her briefcase in the overhead bin, accepted a glass of sparkling water, and looked out the window as the plane smoothly pushed back from the gate. No one asked her to move. No one questioned her presence. She had paid for her seat, but more importantly, she had fought for the safety of every single person in the sky. As the engines roared to life, propelling the aircraft safely into the starlit Sky Doctor, Josephine Carter finally closed her eyes and slept. Do you think you would have remained as calm as Dr. Carter when pushed out of your seat? What she did was nothing short of legendary, turning a humiliating personal insult into a righteous crusade that saved hundreds of lives and brought down a corrupt corporate empire. If this story of poetic justice and unmatched expertise gave you chills, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible real-life stories of people fighting back and winning. Drop a comment below. What would you have said to the gate agent? See you in the next video.